Now let's talk briefly about inverse tangent. Like the others, inverse tangent has another name. We might call it the arctan, or you'll see that inverse tangent notation. Again, not 1 over. That notation is interpreted as inverse tan, or we could write arctan. And again, I like the arctan notation even if the book doesn't use it. So like with the sine and the cosine, we have to restrict our view of tangent to a portion of the graph that passes the horizontal line test. So again, if I look at my tangent graph, I'll notice each of the pieces would cause me trouble, but one piece taken by itself doesn't. And so what I'm going to use is I'm going to use one piece, and I'm going to use the one that passes through the origin, and that piece would go from, would use an angle between -90 and 90. Now notice, in this one, I do not include the 90s. Remember with inverse sine, I did. I needed that in order to get the -1 value and the +1 value. But here I do not, because remember, tangent is not defined at -90 or 90 degrees. So I cannot include the 90s. When you do an inverse tangent, you will never get 90 unless you do something very, 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 very special and the calculator rounds. But the actual value never will give you, never, ever, ever, produce an angle of 90 or -90 degrees. So for our restricted region, the input or domain of tan, so again we're talking about tangent, is an angle in the interval between -90 and 90, not including them. And then the output, remember when we take the tangent, the output will actually be a value between -infinity to infinity. So notice it's a little different than sine and cosine. We end up getting output values on tangent that are any real value. Now if I graph inverse tangent, we'll get a graph that looks something like this. And again, remember that we think in reverse. So the output on tangent was any real. So now the input on inverse tangent is any real. So notice the graph actually runs left and right forever. And then remember the input on tangent was -90 to 90. And again, if I'd put a scale on this, the range on this graph would have been -90 to 90. So just to sum this up, when we're talking about the inverse tangent, the input on inverse tangent will actually be any number. And again, this is different than inverse sine and inverse cosine. With those, our inputs could only be -1 to 1. With inverse tangent, the input is any number, and the output will be an angle between -90 and 90, not including them. So lastly, to sum up, if we knew that y equals tangent of t, then the inverse statement would be t equals the inverse tangent of y, provided our t, that should be a t, not an x, provided our t is between -90 and 90.